With fertility, it's still very much considered to be elective. You don't need a baby. It's not impacting your life. It's not, you're not going to die if you don't have a baby. Well, wrong. What we see is the divorce rate, the suicide rate, the depression rate. Like fertility and not having a child, that is an enormous life event. To go through this journey of wanting a baby and then to not be able to have a child is an enormous impact on your life. Fertility care is not elective. By the time you've decided you want a baby, you need care.
So Tess, welcome to the Healthtech Podcast. How are you doing?
I'm great, James. It's so fun to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Whereabouts are you speaking to us from today, Tess? Where are you based?
I'm in London. Looks like I'm in my living room, but I'm actually in our office in a meeting room here in the middle of London.
Excellent. Yeah, it does look very comfortable. You look very relaxed. And yeah, looking forward to getting into it. I had a chat with Helen from Fertility recently. Jessica and I are having more and more conversations about this type of thing for various reasons. And so, yes, very excited to get you on. And in fact, a lot of the SomX team very excited to have you on today as well. And are looking forward to listening to this. I think women's health, fertility, everything around this is rightfully gathering seemingly momentum and pace, and people far more willing to talk about this. I actually there's an episode that we did of Healthtech Pigeon, our other podcast, last week, and I was chatting to Belle from the SomX team about this. And one of the things that we said on that is that fertility it's a two-person problem disguised as a one-person problem, seemingly. And I know from looking at your website and the way that you guys talk about what you do and the applications of your product and how it can actually support male infertility as well is very interesting. And so there are plenty of things that I want to talk to you about today. And I'm really looking forward to this. But yeah, the first question I ask everybody is for you to tell your story. So Tess, what leads you in life to founding Béa Fertility?
That was such an introduction. I'm itching to dive into male infertility now that you've brushed upon that. But gosh, what led me to founding Béa? Sort of a very circuitous story. I actually, growing up, always wanted to be in a cubicle. I thought that my dream was a desk job in a big corporate. And I sort of really dreamed of having one of those little badges that you use to access the office, but even cooler on the extendable string that you put to your belt. I was like, oh, height of cool, right? And of course, somehow thought, sort of despite dreaming about going into that, always ended up starting things. So I started a business as a teenager, focused on all the wrong things, learned a lot, didn't internalize any of the lessons, started the triathlon club with a friend of mine in university. I have no interest in triathlon. I've actually never done a triathlon in my entire life. I still haven't. But I was very interested in sort of running a club, starting a club, recruiting members, and sort of creating a club that just had a really cool culture. And so we are forever known as the club at Exeter University that did the Knights of Knee social, where you dressed as a knight or shrub. Sort of perennially obsessed with creating things despite my cubicle office dreams. And so after I left university, sort of created something, went down to a media company that gave me a team of engineers and a team of salespeople to build it, launch it, sell it. And I'd spent 9 months building this fantastic piece of sort of pretty complex tech. It was marketing infrastructure for small businesses under the guise of digital loyalty cards. It was too shy to speak to a customer for 9 months, so launched it, and a bunch of these small business owners looked at me and said, yeah, cool, but I don't need it. And so I definitely did learn a lot with that one, and then went on to start an ad agency. I think by that point I'd kind of discovered that branding, positioning, storytelling is sort of my jam, and so created an ad agency that I ran for a few years, and all of that sort of circuitously led me to creating Béa. I love hardware. I say this now, actually, it's funny. I always said that I love hardware. Then I created a hardware business and realized that there's a reason people stay away from hardware. But I was really hunting to create something that was impactful and that would help people, and had some friends that were starting just at the beginning of a fertility journey. And in conversation with them, I thought, gosh, this industry is wild. Like, everyone's talking about the journey, right? Everyone's talking about how hard it is to get pregnant. And then I sat back and I thought, well, why is it hard to get pregnant? Like, there's an entire industry wrapped around helping people get pregnant. Why isn't it being more helpful? And the more you dig into the fertility industry, the more you realize the way it's set up, and I'm sure we'll go into this, but really the genesis of the fertility industry is an event that was pretty controversial. So, I think it was the second ever IVF baby that was born. The Pope referred to her as a child of the devil. So suddenly you have this incredible scientific advancement that is being really scrutinized and labeled and misunderstood. And sort of you have sort of ethical groups and religious groups, and all of these groups weighing into that scientific discovery. And what that means is that sort of publicly funded institutions, governments, etc., stepped back from really funding this, because it was quite contentious in the 70s, right? But then these babies pop out, they're perfectly normal. And the whole world looks at Louise Brown and says, I want a baby like that, right? And by that point, private money had flowed in. And I think there's sort of two things that contribute to the industry as we know it today. There's sort of very low oversight and very high levels of private funding. And the low oversight is sort of a bit of a result of an interesting dynamic where the result of a failed IVF round is very rarely, if not ever, patient death, right? It's not cardiac surgery. So if you go through IVF and the treatment doesn't work for you, you're not putting your life at risk. And what it means is that clinics can kind of market this as a relatively elective procedure, right? That is pretty low risk to them, incredibly high margin. And so the entire fertility industry has sort of moved in the direction of IVF. Why not? The margins are enormous, and the risk is relatively low. And so we have a highly privatized, highly commercialized fertility industry that is really driven by shareholders, which means that the incentives are not aligned to the patient. The incentives are aligned to creating shareholder value. And so the more I got into this industry, the more I thought, okay, fine. IVF is sort of this miracle treatment, right? And I think I always feel like it behooves me to be really clear about my stance on this. The science of IVF is magical. It's the business practice that I have a problem with. And it's a little bit like, if I were to sort of draw a comparison, it's a little bit like if you sprain your ankle, and it's a fairly bad sprain. It's kind of painful, right? And you go to your GP, and your GP refers you for surgery. What happened to physio? What happened to a stepwise treatment pathway? You have one throat infection. You don't go straight for surgery to remove your tonsils. What happened to a stepwise approach to managing infertility? And that was what struck me as the most bananas thing, is where did primary care go in the fertility care pathway? And that's what we're trying to do at Béa. We're creating primary care in fertility. We've brought back an old clinical treatment that existed in the 70s, and we've modernized it. We've put a bit of a twist on it. We've made it something that you can control and you can do at home, but it is the first step on the treatment pathway. It sits between intercourse and IVF, and it's there for you when you're ready to start treatment. And it means that you don't need to start by walking through the doors of a fertility clinic and paying 13, 14K for what is ultimately a very uncertain outcome.
Yes. And briefly, before I take you back and talk about your story a little bit more, just describe the device so that people listening can understand what it is.
Curiously, it used to be referred to as a turkey baster, which I myself used to call it Turkey Baster 2.0, which is why I'm henceforth banned from the marketing department. But essentially, what we have created is a cervical cap. You can think of it a little bit, it looks a little bit like a sort of silicon egg cup. And that arrives to you folded up inside an applicator. The applicator you can kind of think of as like quite a long tampon applicator. So you you produce a semen sample, your partner, your donor produces a semen sample into a sterile collection container. They pour that semen sample into the applicator where that silicon egg cup is folded inside it. And then you use the applicator, I say you, the person with the uterus uses the applicator, inserts it into the vaginal canal, and they turn a handle at the bottom that gently pushes that semen-containing cup onto the cervix. So the clinical treatment is called intracervical insemination. It's a form of insemination in which semen is held at the cervix for an extended amount of time. And so that silicone cup is deployed onto the cervix. You remove the applicator, throw the applicator away. And at the end, the sort of applicator actually pulls out a removal string. Think of it like a tampon string. It hangs outside the body. And after an hour of being inside the body, you just remove it and that's it, you're done.
Fascinating. Plenty of things that I want to talk about with you here. And actually, let's start with some of your background. Lots of people listening, I think, are going to identify. I know that we have a lot of people actually at university that listen and beyond, but people that start clubs at university, it's interesting because you were someone that identifies yourself as you liked starting things. You liked seeing things develop and bringing something into the world. It's quite creative as well. And you had an ad agency as well. So you're clearly a creative to some extent. But I think people that do like bringing things into the world, it's entrepreneurial. You have to be entrepreneurial. And it's just sort of a definition of it, isn't it? Like, in order to bring a club to light, it requires a weird collection of lots of different skills, the ability to sell the club so that you have members, the creativity associated with the marketing of it, simply the desire that doesn't stack up to someone thinking logically about what's actually the benefit to you here. Like, I don't really see the point of you doing this, particularly around something like a triathlon club without running a triathlon. I started the Nottingham University Food Society not really knowing how to cook, or not really like knowing much other than just like wanting to kind of learn a bit maybe, or like I enjoyed tasting the food from lots of different places. So yeah, we set up we set up these cooking classes with like some like teaching kitchens in Nottingham, and we had like a load of people join. We had like a discount card. We went round to like a load of like, I can't believe I'm telling a story. I don't think I've ever told this story on this podcast, but like we went round to like loads of
I love it.
Loads of restaurants in Nottingham and just said like, hey, we're a Nottingham University Food Society. By the way, we've got like X hundred members. Like, can we just give our members a discount? And all the restaurants were like, of course. Like, yeah, like here's a 5%, 10% code. Then all of a sudden we had this like asset that we could sell, and like that would bring people in, we sell this other stuff. So we ended up running this thing like a business that was like profitable. It was crazy. But yeah, I really identify with that. And like, I don't know, I guess when you think back to that time, like, did you see yourself as an entrepreneur at that time? Had you got like businesses in mind or any of that stuff? Or was it just that you loved creating stuff?
No, I never identified. And to be honest, to a certain extent, I still don't identify with the label of entrepreneur. I really don't. I mean, I think a little bit like in your story, what resonates is there's sort of this kernel of an idea that starts with this why not impulse, right? And then you build on the why not impulse, and you're like, why don't I start a society? This is kind of fun, whatever. And then it's like, why don't I go to restaurants and get a discount? Oh, cool. And it's, whilst the original why not kernel might be the size of a pine nut, by the time you've like built this thing out, you know, directionally, we end up with billion-dollar businesses. But I would have never put the label of entrepreneur on myself. It actually made me quite uncomfortable. And I always say this, I hate sales. I hate sales. If you put me in a sales role, I will not succeed. And then everyone laughs and they're like, you're the OG salesperson. I'm not. I think I sell Béa to investors every day because I fundamentally believe in what we're doing. Like, I fundamentally think that this industry has got to change. Like, someone has to take on the Goliath, this sort of incredibly manipulative industry, right? And so I never feel like I'm selling. People always think I'm quite good at selling. But I think I always associated being an entrepreneur with needing to dig in and do that sales piece and all of these things. And so I was like, whoa, that's not me. I'm not doing that. And actually, I think if you love what you do, then when you ask yourself, why not? Like, you're obviously going to build on that, right? If you're sort of like, I don't really know how to cook, but I love food. There's your sort of kernel number one. Being a university student, you don't really have much money, but we love to eat out because we love good food. Okay, kernel number two. And you're sort of layering and layering. But to be honest, starting the triathlon club, I had a friend who was this wonderfully assertive woman. And she was like, well, I would like to do triathlons and there's no club at Exeter. Would you like to start it with me? Honestly, I couldn't say no. Like, I didn't know how to say no. So I was like, yes. It just went from there. And look, I think what I was so proud of with that club, and I think this maybe actually is the common thread, is I created a small group of people who loved being a part of it. And for me, the common thread, even in the agency, we were a small team, 3, 4, 5 people tops, right? But they loved being a part of it. Again, like Béa, people love being a part of it. And for me, where I get my kick is creating something that people love to be a part of. In the triathlon club, the sort of Nights of Me social, what a dumb idea, right? Like, who does that? But also, we were legend for it because everyone went all out and 12 of us entered the student nightclub literally looking like a forest, leaving like leaves everywhere. And it kind of became this thing, this movement. But I think if you said to me back then, you're an entrepreneur, I would have roundly rejected the idea. And to be honest, to a certain extent, I still kind of do.
Yeah, it's interesting with sales because there's two sides to sales, I think, in my experience. And I'm sure there are plenty of people that actually work in sales that I'm just going to butcher this entirely. And it's nothing to do with actual
discount
reality.
Everything we've
Here's
just
my
said.
guide to sales as someone that has never actually done anything to do with sales.
Two people who don't sell.
But I've got my own podcast and it's not regulated, so I can say what I like on here. So here's my guide to sales. Passion, number one, you mentioned it. You talked about passion. I think that is definitely part of it because, yes, that gets the other person energized and receptive to what you're about to say.
Exactly right.
The other side of it then is just how good the deal is. If the deal isn't actually that good for the other side, I think you then have to be more salesy. And that's what I'm not comfortable doing. So what I end up doing is optimizing the hell out of the actual thing that I'm offering someone to make it almost they can't possibly say no because the product's so good, the deal's so good, the idea's so good. So like, why wouldn't that person in that restaurant in Nottingham say yes to offering these 200 people that care about food and might leave them really good reviews because they care about this stuff, a little bit of money off, so that it attracts loads of people through and they'll make more money in the end. That's the deal you can't really say no to. So I didn't have to worry too much about like, oh, I'm going to have to be really salesy. I'm going to have to say salesy things and the dark arts of, psychology and all these things to get someone, trick them into buying this thing. No, I'm actually just going to provide something that's actually just of loads of value. And that's been the case the whole way through. And I think it's the same with you is what you're saying and what I'm kind of getting here, which is like, I think you and I both would not want to go into a sales meeting having to peddle something that, against the sales target to then peddle something that we don't actually think the other person needs or like our thing isn't actually that good. Like, but where we're allowed to be the ones that build it, we're actually just going to build it so it is so good it actually works. It actually delivers value. It's what motivates you to gather the evidence, which I know you've got more of recently and all those things, because you're trying to just make the deal so good, not only for the buyer, but for the end user as well. And I think those two are probably somewhat the same thing in Béa Fertility's case anyway. But it's it's a weird thing it's a weird thing, sales. But the other thing's interesting about what you said is community as well. Like, you love building something for people to be a part of, even in that society itself, in the company itself, in the ad agency itself, in Béa Fertility itself. And I think that's the other thing I think about building SomX as well, which is that I think it's not just the case for me that I'm building something with enterprise value to an exit and then I can enjoy myself, which I think is the mentality of a lot of people that are kind of, building something that they, might not be that invested in themselves. They're just seeing the money as the outcome. Whereas I think, again, I'd rather turn up every day into an environment that I enjoy with people that I enjoy being around. And then I'm sort of like, well, haven't I already got to the end point? Because if I got loads of money, I just have to redeploy it against finding this. So it's kind of like, I'm trying to it's a mixture of the two, I think, in reality. And there's always overhead. It's never perfect. But I don't know about sales and community, if any of that resonates, but it sounds about right.
It does. Yeah, it does. And when I started Béa, I started an email list. And for the last 2 years, every Friday, I write an email to that email list. And now I think it's like 13, 14, 15,000 strong. And I mean, our open rates are like 60, 70%. Because I'll send out an email and 1 week I wrote about the time I accidentally dyed my vagina blue in the name of testing fake semen for the FDA study. Another week I wrote about, like, I got really spicy about some ad that I saw and I was outraged and I kind of wrote about it. And it's this, we hear from users that the emails make them laugh in moments of their lives when they needed it most. And I love that so much, because sometimes I write these things, it kind of feels like you're writing into a vacuum, right? Like, does anyone even read this? And I'm like, do I need to tell 14,000 people that my vaginal canal is like deep dark blue and will be for the next 8 weeks? No, right? But like, is it kind of funny in the trials and tribulations of running a startup? And I think, bringing Béa into the world has been a really funny journey at points. There's the time we tested a competitor's product and fired mayonnaise across the office ceiling 20 feet and had to like clean it out. Anyway, there's like all sorts of moments in the history of building Béa. And I think sometimes I'm starting to see a little bit, and this has been a trend for a long time, right? But the whole like building in public thing. And sometimes I think when I see people building in public, it feels performative. It's very like, look at me, look at my metrics, and look at the standard thing that I learned this week that every entrepreneurial book talks about. And so my version of building in public is to share the real human stories of Béa, to share my outrage at this industry, to share the mayonnaise moment, to share, what we now call Smurfgate, to share sort of these moments, to talk about the time that I cried in a cab because we tested the device for the first time ever. Like, I went to a gynecologist with the cervical cap, fingers crossed, inside me in the right place. And he put in a speculum. I sat down with him and said, I just need you to like put in a speculum and photograph my cervix and tell me if this cap is on it in the right place. And this gynecologist across his desk goes, first of all, this is the weirdest thing I've ever had to do. And I was like, I know, I consent to all of this. And the second thing he said is, yeah, like even physicians can barely find a cervix. So this just isn't going to work. Your little funky applicator will not have found the cervix. And I was like, just stick a camera up there and just see. Just see. And so he's like, all right, here goes nothing. I sort of get up on the bed and I'm thinking, oh God, sure, here goes nothing. And he puts in a speculum and all I hear is 2 words, holy shit. I was like, what? What have you found? Like, you don't get to just look in my vagina and say, holy shit, with no other explanation, right? So I'm like climbing over this, like, they give you this piece of paper to preserve your dignity, right? The man's in my vagina. Of course, the piece of paper means absolutely nothing. So I'm like climbing over this paper to go, what? What do you mean, holy shit? And he goes, that cap is on the cervix. It's covering the entire cervix. You've done it. And I was like, oh, we've done it. And And, there's that moment and it was raining like crazy that day. And I called a black cab to go back to the office. And I was in the back of the cab in tears because it had been such an R&D journey to get to that point, right? The device had broken in a study. I mean, it was just hell. And I was just so relieved that I just cried the whole way in the back of the cab. And the cab driver was like, sort of East End cabbie who had no idea what to do with me. And I'm crying tears of joy looking at these photographs on my phone, like using some kind of fun, whatever app. I'm like technologically completely illiterate. This is like the joke of the team, to like Photoshop out my labia so that I could bring these photographs back to my team without showing too much of my body to them. And then they look at the photographs, then suddenly like all of my colleagues are looking at a photograph of my cervix and vaginal canal, and they're all like, oh my God, we did it. I'm like, guys, we did it. And so like, these are the human stories that when I say building in public, that's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the time that we, launched a D2C campaign and our ROAS was bad and we changed the creative and then it improved. Like, snore. Like, look, not to dump on anyone that's doing that, right? Because I think it's so important to share the lessons. But my version of building in public is sharing, the trials and tribulations of birthing a medical device, right?
Yeah. You've clearly made a decision to live authentically, haven't you? And you've decided what your version of authenticity is, and you've gone, actually, it's warts and all. It's literally everything.
Well, hopefully not warts, but it's definitely all.
I say this for the fact it's a stock phrase, so. not suggesting anything else. But living authentically, I'll tell you what, living authentically is hard work. It's hard work, particularly when you're a business owner, when you're an entrepreneur. You've got clients, you've got customers, you've got investors, you've got all. It can be difficult to walk that line of living authentically and how you want to live authentically, because you're right. Where you're talking, if your version of living authentically is building in public and living out your metrics, well, how much of that can you actually say? And then if you're not living quite 100% authentically on there, you might start to feel discontent even within yourself. And I've had to walk that line a few times myself of like, how much can you actually say? And it just leaves me feeling discontented and like unsure about, like, I want the person that I project to be on LinkedIn or whatever to be the person I actually am. Unfortunately, with a podcast, I've said this a few times, you can't hide behind 350 hours of content. Your motivations are pretty clear for everybody, and how left or right you are is probably relatively clear.
It's going to come out. It's going to come out eventually.
It's going to. And writing an email for you, once a week, every Friday, just recounting those stories. Yeah, it's nice though, because it seems like you're building a business based on your personality, and you're willing to just stand behind it. And I think when you stand for something, people can disagree with you, but they'll always respect you. And I think that's the thing. Like, if you're honest and you're willing to just take a view and you're willing to back up that view, you also might be willing, by the way, to take other information and change your mind. But at least you're willing to just commit and say where you are and stand behind it. I'm so much happier having a debate with someone that's informed and completely, has an opinion. It clearly has an opinion, even if it disagrees with my own. I love that sort of stuff.
Yeah, totally. And it's so interesting to hear you talking about sort of building authentically and building the business around my personality. It's interesting to hear reflected back at me what you hear in my stories, because I would have said that I never wanted to build Béa around my personality. That actually makes me feel insanely uncomfortable. And I'm like, no. I cannot put myself out there in that way. And yet here I am telling 14,000 strangers about me. What's interesting to me is, like, I'm actually a very private person. You wouldn't think it, curiously, but the details of my life I keep very private. But I'm sort of having all shades of reaction to you talking about building a brand based on personality, because I actually would have never thought that I would do that. And to be honest, like, I still struggle a little bit. I have, the marketing team are always saying, you need to start filming reels. I can't do it, James. I sit down in a chair, I turn on a ring light, and I'm like, blocked. I can't do it. I really struggle to put myself out there. I feel like a hell of a lot of fear around it, actually. But then the minute I'm in conversation like this, or the minute I'm emailing, there's sort of certain lanes in which I'm so comfortable being authentic and putting myself into the world. And there are certain lanes, I suppose channels, we'll call them what they are, in which I'm so blocked.
I relate. It's why I have a podcast, actually, is because I can happily in a quiet dark room alone. This podcast can get clipped. Those clips can turn into reels and TikToks. And I don't need to be concerned about holding a camera in front of my face, because it just feels like a conversation, and that's sort of okay. Now we've got the energy. Let's talk about the fertility industry. So big incumbents, profit driven, IVF being this leap from I need a bit of fertility help maybe to now it's a multi-1,000-pound personal cost, is something that I think we have, as you say, sort of just become accustomed to. I think one question that I actually had on this is, how much do you think that's in some way related, though, to, I guess, the urgency involved in a couple that have decided to have a baby? They've been trying for between 12 and 24 months. They all of a sudden realize they need help. Do they not want to skip to the end as well? And is this a case of like, should there be more of a conversation in that 12 to 24 month period where we're considering other things and looking at fertility in a bit more detail?
It's a brilliant question. I love this question so much. So yes, to the sense of urgency. It's a slightly different urgency, though, that I'd put a slightly different spin on it. The success rate of IVF globally, I think, is 27% for a single cycle. Globally. Now, clinics will tell you that they've got 37, 45, 55, 78, whatever. Like, they all report their data very differently. But actually, if you sort of look at HFEA data and you look at sort of global data, 25 to 27%. What that means is that last step in the treatment pathway, that final option, is by no means a guarantee. And so what we often hear, and there's a slightly interesting psychology about this, like if you're unwell, if you really need heart surgery, you want it because you want to get better, right? Maybe there's some fear around that, but you really want to get better. So you're motivated to seek that last step because it's most likely that by the time you're getting surgery, it's probably going to work. But with IVF, it's not always going to work, and people know it, right? And so when people are on this journey, what we hear is that they don't want to start with IVF, because if IVF doesn't work, there's nowhere else to go.
Interesting. How did we get here? You talked about in the 70s, this technology, I believe ICI, intracervical insemination, this technology has been around. So what happened, and why haven't we had, like you talked about, when you have a potentially surgical problem, you consider conservative management, you consider this therapy, that therapy, the other therapy, physiotherapy, but all these things before surgery. Why practically is it not the case that we consider fertility in the same way, and that it has managed to find itself outside of the usual, and I'm thinking UK here, but the usual just NHS practice and way that we do things? How have the private companies managed to kind of sit it outside and provide this alternative as and presenting it as mainstream?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, look, I have thoughts and theories. I'm pretty sure that I'm not too far wide of the mark, but I am, worth sort of caveating that these are all my thoughts and theories,
Sure.
Granted, based on research and interviews and sort of a deep understanding of the space in the industry. But I think there are a couple of dynamics that come into the IVF industry. or the fertility industry, we'll call it. First of all, it is largely labeled an elective procedure. So you don't need it, you choose to have it. Whereas things like cardiac surgery, emergency medicine, etc., these are not elective procedures. By the time you need surgery, you need surgery. Right? It sort of starts to, if it's non-elective, it's really impacting quality of life, right? You need that surgery, you need that intervention, you need that care. With fertility, it's still very much considered to be elective. You don't need a baby. It's not impacting your life. It's not, you're not going to die if you don't have a baby. Well, wrong, right? What we see is the divorce rate, the suicide rate, the depression rate, like fertility and not having a child, that is an enormous life event. To go through this journey of wanting a baby and then to not be able to have a child is an enormous impact on your life. Fertility care is not elective. By the time you've decided you want a baby, you need care. Like, it's not an option for you. You're not sitting there going, maybe I'll have one, maybe not, if it works, whatever. Like, it's not a choice for you. It is this is what I want in my life. Like, why else am I here? And so I think you've sort of asked me about the fertility industry, and there are many tangents and rabbit holes that I could take you right down. But really, one of the dynamics is the elective medical procedure. Another one of the dynamics in the industry that's really interesting is patient harm and risk to patient. If IVF doesn't work, very unlikely that you will die. Very, very unlikely, to be clear. Like, I actually haven't heard of any case of someone sort of passing after a failed IVF procedure. And I'm sure there's maybe some sort of edge cases out there, but essentially the risk of harm to the patient is really low if the procedure doesn't work. And so why not offer it to everyone? What's the harm if it doesn't work, right? Whereas you wouldn't offer cardiac surgery to everybody because the harm of major surgery it's significant, right? So there's more oversight. There's more regulation in other sectors of medicine that don't exist in the fertility world for that reason. And I think the other dynamic, so sort of an elective procedure, patient harm and risk to patient. And then the third dynamic that we see in the IVF industry, in the fertility industry, is the sort of privatization of this industry. So because it's broadly considered to be elective and because it's not life and death, insurance providers rarely cover it. And publicly funded healthcare systems where they're squeezed on budget, this will usually be one of the first things that gets cut. You can understand why, right, James? You're super familiar with the NHS. Would you cut I keep going back to this example, but would you cut the cardiology department or would you cut the reproductive technology department? Right? If your back was against the wall. So what we see in the privatization of the industry is really the lack of public funding for this because public budgets are kind of squeezed. Now, the reason we've ended up with an industry that's highly privatized is back in the 70s when IVF was sort of coming to the fore. When Louise Brown, the first IVF baby, was ever born, it was quite a contentious discovery, right? Like the Pope weighed in, religious groups weighed in. Everyone and their dog had an opinion on this. Everyone was saying, they're not going to be natural babies. Those babies can't consent to this experimental procedure. Et cetera, et cetera. And so it was in that contention, there was a reticence from public bodies to really lean into funding further development of the field. So private money flowed in, filled the gap. And of course, then more private money flowed in, then more.
Yes.
Early on in the development of IVF, the success rates were very low. But they were climbing so rapidly that the clinical world thought this is going to be a silver bullet, right? Everyone's going to get pregnant with that. And so other treatments kind of fell off the map. And of course, where IVF is the highest margin and most expensive treatment, the commercial incentive to hold on to earlier stage treatments in the care pathway also isn't there. So what we saw was everything that isn't IVF, and IUI, to be honest. It's sort of falling away. And we focused on IVF and IUI, intrauterine insemination,
Right.
which is another clinical treatment. We've really focused on those two treatments and developing and commercializing those two treatments. And really these are sort of all of the dynamics that have led us to the industry and the care pathway that we have today.
Understood. So your device itself, who is it for? And of course, I know broadly who it's for, anatomically, etc. But when couples are trying to conceive, and I'm of the age where I have many, many, many friends both trying to conceive, that have conceived, that are thinking about it, etc. I'm in that age bracket currently. The way that people think about fertility now is this huge 180 from couples thinking we must not get pregnant, we must use contraception, we must take the pill, we must take estrogen and progesterone and screw up our hormones to do anything to stop being pregnant, we must use barrier, we must use this, we must use coils, we must use that. It's all this messaging and stuff about must not get pregnant. Then all of a sudden it's this complete and utter 180 into, well, now we're trying to conceive, we need to get pregnant. And it's exactly. Like, it's this strange like juxtaposition of yesterday it was doing everything to not, and now it's doing everything that we must. And then it's in this weird zone of like, well, we should just try naturally. Like, should we get help at this point? Should we get tested, or should we wait? Like, and logic will tell you like, now, no, we should, let's just test our fertility. Let's now use things that optimize it. Let's do it. And logic says all of those things, but we don't act on logic. And my brain doesn't even act on logic, that I then don't want to necessarily confront it necessarily. And like, yeah, maybe we should just try naturally because I don't want to know. I don't want to know, like, da-da-da. So the reason I explain all of that is because I'm wondering about what your vision is here, because I'm wondering that, as you know, we're all, as a society, as a country, we're getting pregnant later quite often in the middle classes and things like that. Like, we're getting less and less fertile for various different reasons, sperm counts dropping, like all of these things are real. Do you have a vision that actually that your device, your medical device that improves the chances of fertility, is something that's used early in this journey of couples trying to conceive, and perhaps trying to normalize it as just something that helps us at a time where we are older and less fertile, and trying to normalize it from that perspective? Or do you see it reserved for, you've been trying for 2 years, you like, this is the first step before IVF, and actually you shouldn't be doing anything before? Like, where do you sit on that? I guess both personally, or your personal is your company, isn't it? So like, where do you sit on all of that?
It's funny that you say the personal is the company. I swear people ask me how I'm doing. I'm like, Béa's fine.
Yeah, Béa's fine.
It's like no separation. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The bottom line of SomX is my happiness. So like, where's that graph going?
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, exactly right. So James, where did you go to school?
I went to school. I was born in Wolverhampton, so I went to school in Wolverhampton. Went to university in Nottingham.
Cool. In the UK school system.
Yes.
Okay. So when you did sex education in school, what did they teach you about pregnancy?
Don't remember it too much. I can remember a couple of those lessons, and the ones I remember were literally just teacher like checked out, just sticks a video on, and it's a video about when a man loves a woman, and then a weird sort of transparency effect of the man then being overlaid over the woman, and these naked bodies joining in unison, and that how pregnancy happens. That's the memory I've got of it.
Wow. You had a very different experience to me. So I was in the school system in Texas. We were taught abstinence, obviously.
Wow, okay.
And
in Texas, yeah, of course. Yeah.
So we were taught nothing other than don't. And then moved to the UK, and we got the whole like condom and banana treatment. But I think, like, long story short, you and I left school thinking that if you even like lay eyes upon someone of the opposite sex, you're immediately going to conceive.
Yeah.
And so you live the rest of your sort of 20s that way, and then you hit your 30s and you decide that actually I'd like to conceive. And everyone's like, well, it's going to happen the first month, right? And the reality is it just doesn't. Like if you get sneezed on by a boy, you're not immediately going to get pregnant, right? Like it actually is a bit of a struggle, and it's not always easy. And function of some of the things you raised there around sperm counts declining. Yeah, sperm counts are declining. It's sort of a ton of factors that go into that. But I really believe that we are entering what we kind of refer to as a bit of a hormone health crisis, endocrine disrupting chemicals in our environment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Sort of a ton of things that fold into that. But yes, human hormone health is not what it was. So you also then have the average age of a first-time mother is now over 30 in the US and the UK for the first time in human history.
Wow, the average. That's interesting.
Average age is over 30. So we now are starting to get pregnant later and later, and we don't have as good a sort of level of population-wide hormone health as we used to have. And so no longer is it the case that you're just immediately going to conceive because we're not all eating organic food and 21 years of age, right? Like we're all sort of in a completely different time in society. What this means is that the fertility journey is no longer linear for everybody. Broadly speaking, 1 in 6 is the sort of accepted figure. About 17.5% of the population will deal with infertility. Infertility is the diagnosis that comes with trying to conceive for 12 months and not being successful at the end of that 12-month period. 12 months is a long time for people who have decided that they want a baby, right? And it's a long time of frankly really stressful sex. By the time you're starting to do timed intercourse and you're like, okay, let's go, and then the miscarriage rate's 1 in 4. This is a really complex journey that we are wholly unprepared for, wholly unprepared for. And so you ask me who Béa is for. I used to sort of have some really strong thoughts on exactly who we're for. And then we launched and the floodgates kind of opened, and actually we got a ton of different people. Our first baby is coming the first week of May, and she's this gorgeous little girl born to a same-sex male couple and their surrogate. I would have never said the sort of gay men and surrogates are who we built Béa for, right? But what an incredible... They have the most incredible story, right? They were hunting for years for an affordable way to start their family. They had a surrogate who'd been a surrogate before, and the clinics were all saying, we need to do IVF. We need to do IVF and charge you for IVF. And they were saying, well, no, but we don't have a fertility problem. We have an operational, call it, challenge.
Yes.
And so enter Béa. They were one of our very first users. And lo and behold, they're expecting the first week of May. And
beautiful. And
for us, that was just such a cool use case. I would have never said that that's who the device was for, but how great. Who am I to create this technology and then gatekeep? That's exactly what we're trying to prevent against in the fertility industry. So I would never, I would never say, oh, you have to have tried for a year before you try this. You have to do this. You have to have a diagnosis. No, I'm not going to gatekeep. What I'm very clear on is there are certain contraindications and instances in which it is not safe for you to use the device. And there are certain conditions for which it's just not safe for you to conceive. And we're very clear about what those are. And if it appears that you have one of our contraindications, we will tell you, this will not work for you. This is not safe. We do not think you should buy this treatment. So I think there's a really careful line between gatekeeping and responsibly marketing this treatment. And we try to tread that line very carefully.
Yes, really interesting, because actually in marketing this, like we've already said, fertility is a two-person problem masquerading as a one-person problem. And actually this can be a solution for some causes of male infertility, low count, low mobility, low morphology. This is a solution for males. It's a device that males use because they need to load the thing up and for a female to also then use. It is a device for couples that are having an infertility problem together. And I think that's interesting messaging and appropriate messaging as well, because I think it is not a female problem, fertility, in the case of these three things I just mentioned, at least, you know.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Here we are, busted by a medic, right? Which I totally like. You just know when you're speaking to a medic because they're like, "Oh, no, it's for male infertility." I'm like, "Well, yes." So essentially, the Béa device is really at its core is sort of a giant sperm optimization stick, right?
Yeah,
it is uniquely addressing count, motility, morphology. It is uniquely addressing a sort of poor semen sample. And by taking that semen sample and placing it directly into the cervical mucus being the perfect chemical partner for sperm, we are encouraging conception. I was speaking to our embryologist, Sandy, and she was saying of the millions and millions and millions of sperm that are in a semen sample. I think by the time you get into a fallopian tube, it's less than 200 that make it there. So if you already have a lower count semen sample, like you're starting from nothing. But if we can concentrate all of those sperm and make sure that they're all in the cervical mucus, which is designed to sort of aid conception, then we give you a better chance. And I think we are branded a femtech company, and we are often referred to as a women's health business. The Béa applicator, our technology does nothing for egg quality. And by the way, if a supplement brand tries to tell you that they do something for egg quality, run. Like, egg quality is sort of, it is what it is. You know, there we can make some lifestyle changes, some diet changes, and sort of give ourselves as much of a helping hand as possible. But fundamentally, Béa is really supporting sperm health. It's giving more sperm a chance to make it to that fallopian tube. And so whilst we are branded a women's health business, it really is, it's curious how much of a male infertility solution this is. And look, that's not to say that if there are issues on the female side that this can't be helpful, right? Like, one of our pregnancies is this incredible story. She's 46 and has been struggling for many years, and they got pregnant with the device. Another woman, she's incredible. She's 41. She has endometriosis, adenomyosis. I mean, you name it, she's got it. And she's now pregnant having used the Béa device. So there are cases where there have been sort of complicating gynecological factors, and the device has been supporting and helpful there. But at its core, yeah, we're a sperm stick, really.
Yeah, because I guess for those people that may not know, that aren't that medical listening, like this, whilst the cervical environment might be fantastic for sperm, the vaginal environment is not great. Its acidity levels means that sperm just die off in there and sort of sacrifice themselves to leave a better environment, so that the guys on top that don't throw themselves at the wall can actually get through. That's a very butchered example of physiology there, but like, yeah, it's about right.
Totally. That's absolutely right. And, you know, the presence of lactobacillus in the vaginal canal, the vaginal microbiome, those bacteria attach to the sperm head and do nothing good for sperm. The pH is sort of all wrong. And it's interesting, when I first started, we were working with the FDA to sort of on the clearance pathway to be able to market in the US. And one thing the agency said was, this is a use case as a hostile vaginal environment. And of course, I'm sort of an ardent feminist, and I was like, well, screw you.
It's interesting language.
Hostile. What do you mean, hostile vaginal environment? And I sort of got all high horsey about this, right? Because I was like, vaginas are perfect as they are. And actually, the vaginal canal is really hostile for sperm. Like, it's not a great place for sperm. But the cervical mucus is like sperm picnic.
Ideal.
Right? Like utopia. A warm, sunny day and a really good sort of John Lewis or Ferdinand Mason, whatever picnic basket, right? The sperm are like, oh, nirvana, we've made it, right? But you've got to get them into the cervical mucus. You've got to hold them there. And intercourse, turkey basters, syringes, all of this shit that's flooding the market is actually not going to really help you get it there.
One of the things you mentioned actually in your introduction was that you love hardware, and then you sort of corrected yourself. And it's one of those things where when you love something, sometimes you have to let it go, etc. You said there's reasons that you discovered reasons that people probably stay away from it. You've built a frankly medical device, a regulated medical device,
Yep.
applicable on human beings. And you've had to probably go through a lot of trials and tribulations in order to do that. And one of those trials and tribulations is evidence as well, because one of the things that you'll need to collect is evidence that this thing actually works. So explain that phrase to me that you mentioned at the start, that you love it and then you hesitated. So explain that hesitation, and talk to me about evidence and what evidence you got for this actually working. Beyond the pregnancies that you've clearly just mentioned, by the way. There's no way that the gay couple didn't get success from this. That's quite clear that it worked in that example.
I'm sure, exactly right. So the reason I love and hate hardware, right? Because hardware is hard, especially medically regulated hardware. There are very few materials that you can safely use because it's going in a vaginal canal. It's in contact with genetic materials. So what we often see that drives us crazy is people just launch these fertility kits and they're off-the-shelf syringes and pots. And we look at the pot and we're like, where's that pot from? It's not a sperm. It's not a specimen collection container. It's not sterile. We don't know what material it is. Like maybe it contains phthalates, which causes sperm to essentially commit suicide. These are just plastic containers that have not been cleared for containing sperm. So all of our semen containers come from medical device manufacturers. They arrive sterile and we HSSA test them, human sperm survival assay. We actually send them to a lab where they procure sperm from somewhere. We don't ask, human sperm. And they put it in the pot and then they take it out half an hour later and they test it. How many have survived? How many of this? How many of that, etc. All of the pots that we see on the market are not semen collection containers. And so it kind of drives us a little bit crazy when we see sort of these kits on Amazon. And anyway, I think it's just like it's a poorly regulated space. And so I could talk about that for hours, but you asked me a question about regulatory sort of hardware being hard, loving and hating hardware. And of course I tangentially started whining about semen pots, which happens a lot. Hardware is really hard because look, if we want to make a change to the product, we need to essentially redo all of our R&D. You're creating 80K worth of tooling. You're injection molding plastics. You need to test it. Does it work? What's the impact? And so really with the reason hardware is so hard is there's no flex. You kind of have to get it right first time, especially if you're venture backed, because you've got the investors putting pressure on you to get it to market and generate sales and get to your next funding round. What's your traction? What are your milestones? And so these are very much in opposition, and they can create this sort of crucible where you feel like you're kind of being formed in the fire because you're really having to balance these tensions and create the best and most robust product you can in the least amount of time possible for the least amount of money. And it's a really hard balance to get right. We haven't always gotten it right. And so I think that's why medically regulated hardware in particular is really hard. We launched the product and we discovered that actually it's not a perfect product and we needed to pull it off and make some quick tweaks and then relaunch it early on in our journey. Now our investors are having kittens, but we have to do that because we've got to do right by the user. We've got to build something that's safe and that works. If it doesn't work, why have we bothered? So I think hardware is just, it's an interesting thing to build. There are many, many, many one-way doors and decisions that you have to make. Once you make that decision, there's no going back. But I suppose the point is actually to make those decisions as quickly as possible with as little information as you're comfortable making that decision with, because only then can you get to the next decision. Only then.
How do you test the efficacy of this? Like how do you, what process do you have for how do you do it? What do you collect and how do you prove it?
So when we first launched, we launched what we called the research edition. So we put these kits out the door at a loss. And our first sort of few hundred users who got the research edition, the deal was, hey, you're getting really cheap treatment. But in return, we'd love it if you can tell us how it went. Could you use it? Can you give us some feedback? Can you tell us what the outcome was at the end of your treatment cycle? And that's where our current efficacy data comes from. So in our earliest group of users, and bear in mind, this is a small cohort, we saw in 56 people, we saw a pregnancy rate of 39.28% over 3 Béa treatment cycles. So, IVF one cycle, 5,000 to 8,000 pounds, 27% success rate. So actually, 350 pounds for 3 cycles of Béa with a pregnancy rate of 39.28%, we're really pleased with. And it really is. And 40% of the females in that group had a gynecological condition. 30% of the males in that group had a semen issue. 60% of that group had been trying to conceive for longer than 12 months. And the average age of the female in that group was 37 and a half.
Whoa.
So we didn't go out and select a group of 25
to make the
24-year-old lesbians with a sperm donor. Yeah. Exactly. Like, this is not a fertile group of people. And I think for us, what we're really trying to commit to is transparency in how we report that efficacy data, and to always keep updating it. We're always going to keep getting new information.
Next question I've got is the business model, because there's probably a business model now, and there's probably something that you want to change to later potentially. There often is with this type of hardware and stuff, whether it's B2B, B2B2C, B2C, etc., etc. So, assuming that there is a B2C element here, you can sell direct to consumers. Is there any other model that you either have now or that you're considering in future, either at a B2B level or even a healthcare systems level, or anything along those lines?
Totally. Imagine you're struggling to conceive. In the UK, your first point of call is your GP. Most of the time, GPs today say, sorry, I need you to go home and try again for another 12 months before you're even eligible for tests, depending on age, right? And then you go back and you're still not pregnant a year later, and your GP will say, oh, whoops, sorry, you're not eligible for IVF. On the NHS, it's a total postcode lottery, age, BMI, all of these things come into it. Your partner has a child from a prior relationship, you can't get IVF. So secondary infertility, you have one, you want number 2, you can't get IVF. Look, in a world where it's super constrained, I understand, but it's painful, so painful. But to answer your question, ideally for us in the NHS, imagine you go to your GP, you've been trying for sort of 6-8 months, you're ineligible for IVF, but your GP says, I'm going to send you home with 3 to 6 months of this treatment. Give this a go. If you're not pregnant at the end of this, come back in. Like, I'd love for this to be sort of distributed through the NHS as primary fertility care. That's kind of what we're trying to spearhead, is the preclinical journey as delivered by GPs. Yeah.
It's really interesting, because even in my own head, when you think, I had Hugh Harvey on here last week, just talking about health economics, and, building a health economic case for this is relatively straightforward, probably, on all the things that you talked about, either with mental health and suicide. There's plenty of things that can be brought into here to make both a moral and a philosophical and indeed an economic argument, because in relative terms, we're talking about a low-cost device for a very, very, very high value solution. And that value is, of course, felt not the most by the parents in many ways, but even, I'm sure, economically, there can be plenty to be said about the value of a previously childless couple for any, issues that might come downstream, or even the value that child can provide onto the economy, etc. In a world of potential population collapse.
Maybe solves climate change.
Well, indeed.
That's what we say anyway.
Absolutely. And what stage are you guys at currently? Where are you at in your, I guess, growth as a company, as a business? And is this something people can purchase straight off the shelf now?
Totally. Come to beafertility.com. Unfortunately, when you buy, your email address goes onto that community list, so you get my Friday rambles. Feel free to unsubscribe.
The blue dye emails, the Smurfgate emails.
Blue Smurfgate, blue vagina gate.
Absolutely.
Obviously, you can always unsubscribe. Buying Béa does not commit you to a lifetime of receiving my drivel. Imagine. But you can come to sort of beafertility.com and just buy treatment straight from us. We are sort of Sandy is our lead embryologist. She also runs free coaching sessions every month. So come along, join, even if you're not a Béa customer. If you have questions about fertility, you want to talk to a clinician, talk to an embryologist, come along, come hang out, come ask anything you want in those free sessions. You know, they're there for you. And at the moment, in terms of where we're at, we've been on the market for 8 months in the UK. So young, like pretty early in our journey, but already, you know, our first baby's coming. We couldn't be more excited. And we're seeing some pretty steady growth in the UK market. And some really cool pregnancy stories coming from our users as well, which we love so much.
Tess, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. You are such a wonderfully passionate founder, living incredibly authentically through your business, through your content, and particularly through your email list. It's, yeah, as I say, been an absolute pleasure having you on. I do find this stuff interesting, not least because I'm at the stage of life where it's front of mind for me in a lot of cases, for many, many, many of my friends at this point. And I think being a man in this scenario, it's like I said, it's masquerading as a female problem, but this is the solution to a lot of male problems too. And I guess I just hope in some way that by having this conversation on here, where we have a diverse audience, that it at least brings that to light, that fertility is branded as femtech, it's branded as women's health. It's just that it seems that the solutions just have to be that way. The solutions have to be a device for the female, but that's a burden and not their fault. That's just how we're built. Right. Unfortunately, it shouldn't be though how it's considered at scale. I don't think. Well, it shouldn't. It's not that I don't think it shouldn't be considered that at scale. And so that's that for people listening. I think that's what I'd like. That's what I'd like people to take away, is that this is a two-person problem masquerading as a one-person problem. It is a male solution as much as this is in fact, arguably more so than it is a female solution to a problem. And I think we should all be engaging for that reason. Tess, been a pleasure. Thank you.
Such a pleasure, James. Thank you for indulging me.
Very welcome. Very welcome.